the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Militarism and war in Israel. We'll hear from two brave women, activist Alicia Baskin and filmmaker Leah Tarachansky, who both lay bare the project of Israeli occupation and the weapons of war wielded against Palestinian communities. That's coming up in just a moment. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. In the wake of revelations that the NSA was sharing intelligence information with Israel's Unit 8200 about Palestinian Americans and others, a group of Israeli soldiers signed a letter saying they refused to comply. Unit 8200 is Israel's military intelligence wings. The refuseniks, as they call themselves, said they were, quote, conscientiously objecting to serving the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. They were deemed criminal by the IDF and Israel's defense minister. But the actions of a small handful of Israeli soldiers will likely not be enough to thwart the might of what many are realizing is a military-industrial complex in Israel rivaling that of much larger nations. It turns out that Israel is a top arms exporter worldwide, selling weapons that might have been battle-tested in Gaza and the West Bank. To illustrate this disturbing fact, Israel just wrapped up its annual drone conference, during which it showcased drones that had been successfully deployed during the devastating Operation Protective Edge in Gaza, where 2,100 Palestinians were killed. Israeli peace activists attended that conference holding up large posters of the Gaza devastation, stamped with the words "Battle Ready," in an effort to prick the conscience of conference attendees. One such activist, who is a Jewish Israeli activist and researcher working as a fellow in the East Jerusalem office of the American Friends Service Committee, is my guest. Her name is Alicia Baskin. She was also a conscientious objector and did civil service at the Israeli section of Amnesty International. She continued to work with a variety of social justice organizations such as B'Tselem, Asaf Aid for Refugees and Asylum Seekers in Israel, as well as Students for Justice in Palestine, United for a Fair Economy, SEIU Local 615, and Jewish Voice for Peace. She was traveling recently through Los Angeles, where this program is based, and I spoke with her about the Israeli military industry. Welcome to Uprising, Alicia Baskin.
Hi, welcome.
Thanks so much for joining us. So in the context of the Israeli siege of Gaza and also this recent operation, we hear a lot about U.S. arms sales to Israel, which is why it's such a big issue here in the United States in terms of the legitimacy that the U.S. gives to Israel. One of the things that we don't hear very much about is Israel's own military industry, especially weapons-producing industry. And I was surprised to learn that Israel is actually one of the top weapons exporters in the world. Put it into context globally.
Yeah, this is true. Israel is today between the 6th and the 10th largest arms producer and exporter in the world, which it depends on which what source you're looking at, between 6th and 10th. And for a country this small to be able to reach that prominence in the world raises a few questions about how did we get there as a country. And one of the reasons that have given Israel a large boost, or two of the main reasons. One is the continuous U.S. backing and the military aid, which allows Israel to develop and advance all sorts of weapons that's on its own it would not be able to do. And the second reason is that Israel has in its own backyard two territories, namely the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, in which it can basically test all kinds of weapons and technologies that would not be able to be tested elsewhere. And this is the laboratory of the West Bank and Gaza, in which weapons that were tested on human beings could be marketed as battle-proven, tested in real time. And we can actually see a direct correlation between attacks on the Gaza Strip, for example, or large operations in the West Bank, and the boost of sales abroad as a result.
So, I mean, are you saying that when the Israeli Defense Forces launch attacks on Gaza, like we just saw this summer, that they're carefully monitoring how some weapons are actually behaving in the battlefield and using that as a sales pitch?
That's correct. In the previous attack on Gaza, the large one in 2009, one of the leading generals in the Israeli army actually said it very clearly. He said, "We have learned how to turn blood into money," in those words. And what he's referring to is using different kinds of weapons that are being introduced in every new battle round. And what the responses are abroad is that companies are paying close attention. The companies are very proud of the performance of these weapons, and they take advantage of these rounds of attacks to market their products. And actually, one of the correspondents of Defense News in Israel said in the paper a few weeks back, she said, these attacks is like drinking an energy drink that gives a big boost for these industries to go forward. And we see foreign governments lining up, and after every attack, there are big arm expos. There was just a drone expo last week.
So a drone expo, and those are unmanned aerial vehicles that are capable of essentially dropping weapons without needing an actual person flying in the sky. What are those the kinds of weapons? Can you give us an example of the kinds of weapons that Israel is selling and testing?
Absolutely. These are highly sophisticated weapons and technologies that could be theoretically used for only civilian use, quote unquote, which mean monitoring and surveillance purposes. However, in the case of Gaza, these unmanned vehicles are also armed, and the person operating them is sitting in a protected room off-site, far away, and like a computer game, has a joystick and just sees something on the monitor. A person can hit the button and the bomb drops. So this is one of the big. Israel is the number one drone exporter at the moment in the world.
The Hermes 900.
Hermes 900 is one of them. This is a drone that actually, this is a good example because it was not operational before this previous attack on Gaza, and they used this current attack as a way to introduce it into the market. It's basically the best marketing tool that they have, is to show it and say, this is how it works. And it works. We see the numbers of sales and the value of companies, and they just rise during and after military operations. And then there's some downtime, and then we go into the next round. So there's a clear dependence on both these ongoing annual attacks on Gaza. We are already in an annual round. But in addition, we need to remember that even when there aren't attacks, these unmanned vehicles are monitoring 24/7. And there's a whole nother type of weapons that are used in the West Bank, mostly crowd control weapons that are manufactured in the United States, tear gas canisters, etc. These are weapons that are not, we don't know what the effect on them on humans are until they are tested.
So are you suggesting that even the U.S. weapons that the U.S. sells/gives to Israel are being tested in the West Bank, crowd control weapons?
Absolutely. Companies that produce the crowd control dispersal techniques, namely different kinds of tear gas, but also chemicals for the skunk, which is basically a liquid that is sprayed onto a crowd that is like sewage. It sticks to your body. It's a very bad chemical. These are produced and bought from the United States and sold and used on civilians. They're used on people that are peacefully protesting. They have killed protesters as well. These are being produced here in the United States and manufactured. And maybe it's important to note also that even not only the weapons, but the aid, the military aid that comes from the United States to Israel is in violation of America's own laws with regards to providing military aid in to countries who consistently violate human rights.
Yeah, we actually interviewed a Palestinian lawyer here in Southern California, where this program is produced, who is suing the U.S. government for aiding Israel because of the fact that our tax dollars have been used indirectly to kill members of his family. Well, let's talk about the fact that we have generally thought of the U.S. as being the weapon supplier to Israel, but is Israel also selling weapons back to the U.S.? I mean, if this is one of the top weapon sellers in the world, is the U.S. one of its customers?
Absolutely. The first thing that's important to realize about the aid that Israel receives from the United States is that the 75% of this aid is actually money that goes back into the U.S. economy, because these are vouchers that Israel has to spend in the United States. So Israel, in a way, is a mediator between American tax dollars and the American military corporations like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, etc. However, a portion of this money is spent domestically, which is Israel is the only country who is a recipient of USAID that is allowed to use foreign funding in its own economy. But that money goes to developing weapons and technologies, or even bolts and parts of weapons that end up in bigger systems that are made in the U.S., like the F-35 fighter jet, which is not a working jet, and nobody is interested in it, and has cost American tax dollars millions and billions of dollars.
So let me just try to follow the money here. U.S. tax dollars go to Israel. Some of that is then used to actually produce parts that go into weapons that Israel sells back to the U.S. and to other countries. And it's this economy that's based on weaponry.
That's correct.
Where Israel and the United States are sort of prime centers. And the people of Gaza and the West Bank are the testing grounds, the subjects.
Right. Yeah. Israel and the U.S. have share a few things in common, and they are both neoliberal economies that are basing more and more their policies on fear, on Islamophobia, and more and more on dependence on these weapon industries to produce revenue. And in the U.S., the biggest lobbying companies are the military companies, and in Israel, the biggest one of the biggest markets is the defense industry, the homeland security, etc. And they collaborate. And part of the deal between the U.S. and Israel is that they maintain an ongoing military relationship, and it's actually mutually beneficial, which is counter to what we think of sometimes as Israel being a small country that is dependent on the United States. We actually see that the U.S. receives pretty significant benefits from supporting Israel.
So, with respect to this industry that Israel bases part of its economy from, how significant is it to the economy as a whole? Because Israel is a small country. It's struggling in many ways. You know, it's dependent on Palestinians for resources, for labor, and it is increasingly becoming a pariah state around the world because of its actions in the occupied territories. Is it relying more and more heavily on the weapons industry as a source of national income?
The answer is mixed, because a lot of, like I said previously, a lot of these weapons can be used in non-lethal ways.
I mean, this is reminding me of the argument we have in the United States about assault rifles being considered something that ordinary people should have the right to tote around when they really are weapons of war, like military-grade weapons being sold to ordinary people because they can be nice playthings.
Right. So it's true. And sometimes when we're trying to assess how significant are these weapons to the economy, the line is sometimes not very clear, because some things are considered and called Homeland Security, defense, military, but there's a whole nother field of high tech and technology that we don't always know what is the transfer of those military those civilian use technology into the military systems. But Israel is a militarized country, and all of the politicians have gone through the army. And the army is a crucial part of the exports of what
Right.
is being exported from the state.
So, because Israel is also involved in these sorts of very almost regular military incursions, I mean, we've had what, 4 incursions on Gaza, these really violent operations in just a handful of years. There's not that many nation states, there's not that many governments in the country that are engaged on such a regular basis on using weapons on a population of people. Does that uniquely place Israel as a weapons seller because it has this, I mean, I hate to put it this way, access of test subjects?
Yes, the answer.
I mean, that's horrific.
Yeah, this is true, and they take advantage of it. The companies take advantage of it. There's also a great deal of personal profiteering of the people that are making these decisions to go into Gaza and to do an attack. There are many people behind this chain of decision making that are personally invested in these companies, that are invested in these exports. And we have to look at that as well. There's a degree of corruption. There is no oversight of these industries, hardly any oversight of these industries, which means that individuals that are making decisions, how to attack, when to attack, what the scope of it is, have an economic motive.
Incentive, right, yeah. So are these Israeli private companies we're talking about here? Are they international manufacturers that have Israeli bases that are collaborating with the Israeli government? What does it look like on the ground?
Yeah, it's both. There are both national companies that are state-owned companies that are very big and produce also unmanned vehicles, different kinds of explosives, radars, etc. There are also private companies that are Israeli private companies. Many of them, like Elbit Systems, for example, have subsidiaries and sister companies in the United States. They sometimes carry a different name. So that for people that are working outside of Israel, it's important to find out where those companies are based in the U.S., where their offices are,
Right.
and what their business is.
Any names you can throw out?
Sure, all of the big companies, IWI, Elbit, TAS, and yeah, there are many more Israeli companies that are producing weapons that have subsidiaries here.
No, there hasn't been much.
And Rafael, sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
There hasn't been much coverage of this aspect of the Israeli occupation, if you will. And there's a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that's happening around the world. Has there been a concerted effort, and perhaps your own organization, the AFSC, is leading this, to draw attention, to focus and shine the light on this insidious aspect of the Israeli occupation?
Yes, companies are having to confront more and more kind of the images of what the havoc that they are creating around the world because of activists that are targeting these companies. There are divestment bills that are trying to be passed.
Specifically targeting Israeli weapons manufacturers?
There are, the biggest ones have actually been American companies that are profiting from their work in the occupied territories. The famous example is Caterpillar, but General Electric, ExxonMobil, Boeing,
Parsons,
Lockheed Martin, Parsons, big companies that are based in the U.S. that are and individuals are invested in. Either their institutions are invested or they are personally invested. AFSC has now created a screening tool for investors who can actually check where their money is going in their investments and where they can divest. So there's a big effort, and we saw during this past attack on Gaza, activists doing die-ins and actions outside of factories, outside of Boeing factories, etc. So there is some power that people have in their communities. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Alicia Baskin, very much for joining us. Is there a website you'd like to recommend for our listeners and viewers?
Sure. I would refer everybody, first of all, to watch the film The Lab, which is made by an Israeli filmmaker, and he shows exactly how Israel is using Gaza and the West Bank as a laboratory for developing weapons and testing them on human beings. AFSC.org has great resources. Who Profits is another organization that profiles companies that are profiting from the occupation. And yeah, there are many more, but I would say this is a good start.
Great. Well, afsc.org is the website, a film called The Lab. We will post all that information on our website, uprisingradio.org, later today. Alicia Baskin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sonali.
Alicia Baskin is a researcher working as a fellow in the East Jerusalem office of the American Friends Service Committee. She's a conscientious objector who did civil service at the Israeli section of Amnesty International and continued to work with a variety of social justice organizations such as B'Tselem, Asaf Aid for Refugees and Asylum Seekers in Israel, as well as Students for Justice in Palestine, United for a Fair Economy, SEIU Local 615, and Jewish Voice for Peace. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. This is an hour-long special on the Israeli military-industrial complex and its impact on Palestine. Many of you know that the U.S.'s special relationship with Israel is in large part responsible for legitimizing Israel's occupation of Palestine. On that note, we turn next to political prisoner and award-winning journalist Mumia Abu Jamal, who filed this commentary.
What is Palestine to the U.S.? For some, this may come as a surprise, for it seems illogical. But the U.S. doesn't hate Palestine. It votes consistently with Israel in the UN, even against the majority of the world's nations, yes. It arms and finances its nemesis, Israel, yes. It quietly and surreptitiously allowed Israel to become a nuclear power, yes. All this is true, but the U.S. doesn't hate Palestine. The truth is something far worse, for dismissal is more damning than hatred. Palestine, its people, its history, its culture, its art, its poetry, its very land, is dismissed as a mere trifle by the U.S. empire, not dissimilar to the response of the old British Empire, which dispatched the lands, hopes, and dreams of the Palestinians with cold, imperial aplomb. For empire is ever an exercise of global violence, for domination is but utter violation, the very root of violence. It violates the human soul, which yearns for freedom. Palestine was relegated to the misery of a warren of Middle Eastern ghettos for one reason, and one reason only: to allow the erection of a colonial outpost from which Britain, and later the U.S., could exercise power in a region that held the greatest prize in world history, petroleum. That outpost, Fortress Israel. Petroleum lit the lampposts of London and fueled the factories of America, leading to its industrial age. It needed a century to protect this precious resource. It needed a watchdog in this neighborhood. Enter Fortress Israel. Palestine is a minor afterthought to the U.S. empire and its imperialist apologists. Her pain, her sufferings, her gross humiliations don't bother the empire one whit. Yet to millions of people throughout Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas, their unjust and cruel treatment finds purchase in hearts worldwide. From their losses spring the fruits of solidarity that binds us, human to human, man to man, woman to woman. As the cruelties of imperialism mount, giving rise to anger and distaste, the forces of solidarity grow too, encapsulating the majority of the people of this earth. From Imprisoned Nation, this is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
Mumia Abu Jamal is an award-winning journalist and political prisoner. You can find all of his commentaries online at prisonradio.org. This is Uprising. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali, where you can watch whole episodes of this program. When we come back, as part of our hour-long special on the Israeli military-industrial complex, we'll hear from Leah Tarachansky. Back in a minute. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Anger over Israel's attempt to change its policies on the East Jerusalem holy site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque has resulted in 2 car attacks just weeks apart. Earlier this week, a Palestinian man rammed his car into a group of Israeli police, killing one and injuring over a dozen others. He was shot dead by Israeli police. Hamas has taken responsibility for the incident, citing continued Zionist crimes against the mosque and sparking fears of another Palestinian intifada. Jordan's government has recalled its ambassador to Israel, citing what it calls unprecedented Israeli escalation in Jerusalem's holy sites. Also this week, Amnesty International released a report calling Israel's war on Gaza this summer rife with war crimes. The group used harsh language, saying Israel had expressed callous indifference in its attacks on civilians. The report documented 8 instances where Israel attacked civilians in their homes, killing more than 100 people, 62 of whom were children. Meanwhile, moves are afoot in Europe to recognize a Palestinian state. 66 years after the founding of the State of Israel and the loss of Palestine as a nation, British MPs in mid-October passed a symbolic vote to recognize a Palestinian state. And just yesterday, French lawmakers are preparing a similar resolution to bring before their parliament. At the same time, former Italian Foreign Minister Federica Mogherini, who just began her term as the new EU foreign policy chief, told press she would like to see a Palestinian state within 5 years. Palestinians refer to the loss of their homeland as al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. Yet most Israelis remain blissfully unaware of the mass expulsion of Palestinians that paved the way for their new state. Some Israelis who were actually on the front lines of that expulsion project do remember, however, and they're featured in an award-winning documentary called On the Side of the Road by my guest Leah Tarachansky. Now, she's a former West Bank settler herself. She's a filmmaker with Real News Network, and she joins me in studio. Welcome to Uprising.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, since you're a journalist who's closely monitoring the news, I'm sure, let's get to a couple of things that are in the news, all of which are, of course, relevant to the historical context that you explore in your film. What's behind what Israel is doing in East Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque at this point?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Basically, shortly before the last attack on the Gaza Strip started, there were protests all over the West Bank and in Jerusalem as well. And these protests have started long before the attack and are now intensifying. But it's a series of provocations, including settlers who have set up hundreds of housing units in East Jerusalem and have taken advantage of the political chaos. Also, over the last few weeks, we've seen a number of provocations in the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the old city of Jerusalem, where politicians and various settler leaders have expressed basically that Israel's sovereignty over this territory and their intention or their wish that this holy site be demolished for the establishment of the Jewish Third Temple, something which enrages not only Palestinians, but also Muslims all around the world.
Now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third most holy site for Muslims around the world. So this is sort of a pretty broad provocation, not just against Palestinians. Now, let's also talk about what happened in Gaza this summer. I read some of your reporting. I saw some of your reporting over the summer when you were doing work for the Real News Network. The Amnesty International report this week cited some very severe instances of what seem to be at least pretty clear war crimes. Are you heartened by this report? Do you think that there's enough documentation of what happened?
It was chaos documenting what was happening, specifically because so much was happening. Access to reliable information as a journalist is very difficult. The Gaza Strip was severely bombarded the entire war, and a number of things were happening at the same time. So for those of us who were following it very closely, it was a daily struggle to basically form a very good image of what was going on the ground. And I imagine that for the human rights workers and the human rights law investigators, it was even harder because they went in afterwards and had to rely on a lot of testimonies. So it's a very difficult job. I do not envy those people who had to do it. And what was interesting about this war is that before it was even over, just shortly after the first ceasefire was called into action, the Israeli army announced that it's starting its own self-investigation. Now, what was the most heartening for me is not only Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and all these international bodies, and hopefully the UN, but Israeli organizations in Israel have issued a very, very critically important statement saying that the Israeli courts, the Israeli internal investigation systems are not strong enough, do not have enough legal independence to do a proper investigation of what had happened, which seems from the outside as sort of a given, but in the world of criminal law, international criminal law, and international humanitarian law, a country has to be proven to be unable to bring to justice its perpetrators in order for cases to go to the ICC. So Israeli organizations publishing this information is incredibly significant, and the Israeli state comptroller has actually issued year after year reports. He's kind of like the critic of the state, again and again, citing that the Israeli army doesn't have any separation between those who perpetrate the actions and those who investigate them.
And speaking of the ICC, the other piece of news this morning was that the ICC said it would not take up the case of the attack by Israel on the Mavi Marmara, part of the Gaza flotilla. I want to get to your documentary, and we've been talking about Gaza. Your film, On the Side of the Road, tells a story of how it is that there are hundreds of thousands of people living in Gaza today, where they lived before, what happened more than 60 years ago. I'm assuming the reason why your film is called On the Side of the Road is because all of the disappeared Palestinian villages that used to be on the side of the roads in Israel are now just no longer there.
Yeah, it's called On the Side of the Road for a number of reasons. That is the main reason for an international audience. For an Israeli audience, it resonates with something else, slightly different. I named it after an incredibly important book by an Israeli historian by the name of Noga Kadmon. Noga wrote a book called, in rough translation, On the Side of the Road, on the Margins of Consciousness, B'tzidei HaDerech, in Hebrew. And this book documents not only what had been exposed previously by Palestinian and Israeli historians about 1948 and that whole period in our history that sparked the conflict as we know today. But how the villages were systemically erased long after 1948, all the way up to the late 50s, and you can argue the dispossession of the Palestinians never ended. It's all one continuous project. And we're seeing now also the demolitions of Bedouin villages in the Negev Desert in the south. So it's one continuous thing, but I wanted to honor her book. She goes and digs in the minutes of committee meetings and how they were deciding how to rename the villages, how to erase them off the map. She goes and documents how the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, was a key player in beautifying the landscape, meaning erasing these hundreds of villages. So I wanted to sort of pay homage to her work. I wanted to invoke this image to ask the viewer what is on the side of the road. And it's also refers to a scene in the film where I go back to the settlement where I grew up. And the experience that I have there as someone who profoundly loves this place, loves my Palestinian and Israeli friends and family there, and profoundly disagrees with the regime and the dispossession and the conflict, the contradiction that you live with constantly as a critical Israeli living in Israel, in a state that is daily becoming more and more repressive,
Right.
where voices like mine and like voices of activists are daily silenced.
I want to bring up a couple of people that you feature in your film, since since the film is sort of centered around what happened in 1948, the erasure of that history, the year of the founding of the State of Israel. You tracked down this interesting woman named Tikva, who actually fought in 1948, remembers the villages that were once there. Tell us about this woman.
Sure. And just to add, the film sort of is about 48, but it includes the history before, and it links it almost every scene with today. So it connects 48 to 67 to today. Tikva Honik Parnas was in the Palmach, which was one of the Jewish militias that later formed the Israeli Defense Forces. And her unit was involved in one of the most violent and one of the most intense fighting in that war, fighting for the road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And she is actually the reason I made the film. Someone once, many years ago, sent me a clip where she says, she describes an incident where she drives on this road many years after the war with a Palestinian friend who's a historian. And as they drive from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and along this road there were about 18 villages that were emptied, demolished, and in their place, forests were planted. If you know this road, you probably know that it's covered in forests. These are monoculture forests planted by the Jewish National Fund to cover up the remains of these villages. And as they drive on this road, he tells her, oh, Tikva here was a village, and its name was Saris, and ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. And she goes, no, there was no village here. And he goes, no, listen, Tikva, I know, I'm a historian. There was a village on this hill, and its name was Saris, and it was, expelled in this day, and da-da-da. And she says, I fought here, I was here in these hills, I know, there was no village here. And they drive like this for a few kilometers when all of a sudden, she says, she's flooded with this wave from some horrible place of deeply profound denial, of some darkness. She's flooded with memories of this, what she calls a ghost village, an empty village, where after they would advance the front line towards Jerusalem, she would like to go there in this village and walk through its empty houses and go into the houses. And in many places she would see that the dinner table was set, that the shoes were by the door, that the dishes were not yet washed because people had to leave. They had to leave like that. Sometimes to a totally uncertain future. Many of them were expelled to Gaza, to Jordan, to the West Bank, to Lebanon, to Syria. There's millions of refugees now all around the world. And this village, this place that she liked to go walk around in, she repressed its memory. She repressed how beautiful it was, to the point where she almost forgot that it was once stood on the side of the road.
There was also an elderly man named Amnon, who you also profile a similar situation. You took him to the place where he fought, more than 60 years ago, but he didn't really want to. He was reluctant to go. And I'm wondering if you can address that denial from those who were there at the time, and how that trickles down to the younger generation today, who really don't see it, see the reality of what happened, don't want to see it. How those things go hand in hand, the sort of generational, both the older and the younger generations' erasure of history.
Yeah. A lot of, when I screen the film, especially in Israel, there's this reaction that happens often where the people see the film and they say, thank you very much for this film, but you're wrong. And, I say, okay, where was I wrong? And they say, I don't know, but you're wrong. And I say, could you point to anything in the film that I got wrong? And they say, no, I don't know what you got wrong, but I'm a good person. I live a good life. And I'm right. So if I'm right, you have to be wrong. And I think that summarizes a lot of people's feelings about history. That if you acknowledge what had happened, if you acknowledge that this huge campaign in the 47, 48, 49 that set into motion the dispossession of 2/3 of the Palestinians and continued to displace Palestinians until today, if you acknowledge how profoundly it impacted the Palestinian people all around the world, and you start to ask very basic questions, such as, why are the Palestinians fighting us? What do they want? And these are questions that we never ask ourselves in Israel, because no one ever encourages us to ask these questions. We are constantly taught all of the time that they just want to kill us. The only way in which we interact with Palestinian people, the only way in which we are even aware of their existence, is either as soldiers, and they are our subjects in the occupation, or we read about them in a newspaper trying to kill us in one way or another. As you said, there was an attack by a car. The only interaction, the only thing we know about them is that they want to kill us, and that's it. And so it's natural that the debate today, almost disintegrated into the camp that wants to expel the rest of the Palestinians and the camp that wants to kill them, and a very, very small voice saying, hey, something here is really wrong.
So one of the ways in which, of course, people try to have an explanation then, why do they hate us? The only reason they might want to hate us is if they're kind of crazy, if they are subhuman, and that's where the racism springs from. And it was amazing to see some of the rampant racism among many Israelis towards the Palestinians, and many, as you said, openly say they'd want the Arab citizens of Israel to be completely expelled, but they also sort of proudly proclaim they are racist. So you have a woman in your film where there's this confrontation on the Israeli independence, or Al-Nakba Day, where she says, I am a racist, I am a racist. I mean, that's incredible. Why is that acceptable or open or something to proudly proclaim by a people who have been the target of so much global racism, right? And I'm sure those questions confound you as well.
Well, just briefly, what I will say is that Israel, the kind of state Israel is an ethnocracy. Yeah. This is a term that was coined by an Israeli political scientist called Or Niftachel. And an ethnocracy is very quickly a state that is organized around the idea of one ethnic group being a dominant group, usually in a post-colonial context, diverting the land and the resources to the benefit of one ethnic group. In Israel, it's the Jews, at the expense of the indigenous population and other populations. And of course, it involves a very elaborate legal system and a very thin layer of democracy. So, yes, when Israelis say that they are racist in the context of the Palestinians, what they mean is that they want a Jewish state for the Jews, by the Jews, and only the Jews. And this is, in essence, the problem. It's not the street-level racism of people who are ignorant that bothers me. It is the state-level racism that that diverts resources from Palestinian municipalities, that has 30 different laws that on their very surface discriminate between Jewish citizens and non-Jewish citizens of the state. And there's many more laws that discriminate in practice. There's no immigration laws in Israel. You cannot just immigrate and become a citizen. Only if you're a Jew can you move to Israel. And somehow the world, I think because of the Holocaust, has legitimized in Israel this idea that this exceptionalism is okay. But Israel is not the only ethnocracy. You have Sri Lanka, Indonesia, South Africa was an ethnocracy, some of the Balkan states, some of the Baltic states. And what is inspiring to me is that when you look at states that used to be ethnocracies from the word ethnicity, such as Macedonia, states that have transitioned out of ethnocracy, it's by far not a perfect example. But you can start building the path towards a just democratic society where all citizens of the state have access to the same equal rights. And a member of parliament in my film, he was speaking in the parliament, and he said it very plainly. He says, those who challenge this ethnocracy, you proclaim that you are for democracy, but you're not for democracy. You have a problem with the Jewish state. You want a state for all its citizens, and we won't let you do that. Because
there's the fundamental issue.
And that is the fundamental issue, that a state for all its citizens inherently takes apart a Jewish state. But a Jewish state has as much legitimacy as saying that America is a white Christian state. Yes, it was founded by white Christians, but you have the indigenous population and all of the groups of the later immigrants.
I can't help but think about the story we covered in great detail on our show just yesterday, where we spoke with historian Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz about her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And there's so many parallels, of course, very different situations, but still so many parallels about how the U.S. was founded on land that was already occupied by indigenous peoples, and how Israel was founded on land already occupied by indigenous peoples, and how there's this conscious forgetting today in both countries about the settler colonialist project that was at the basis of their founding. So your film now, you explain in your film that there was a law that was passed in Israel that made it a crime of treason to challenge the dominant narrative of 1948. Have you committed treason by this film on the side of the road, making this, really challenging this narrative?
Yeah, the reality on the ground in Israel today is that if you believe that Israel should be a state, a democratic state for all its citizens, you are put in a camp that is called radical leftists. If you just believe that everyone should have equal rights, like you have here, at least legally, in America, you are considered a traitor. And that means that you are isolated and marginalized. If you are Palestinian, it means that you probably will be fired. There's a good chance that you will face, like, for example, a Palestinian member of the Israeli parliament was stripped of her parliamentary privileges. So if arguing that Israel should be a democratic state, a post-segregation state, where all of the citizens should be equal, if that's treason, then yes, I'm a traitor. And I think that we need to betray this idea. I think that this idea is the worst idea Judaism has ever come up with. Judaism, in my opinion, is a religion and a civilization, as Viktor Frankl called it, that has contributed profound things to this world, and has contributed to cultures everywhere Jews have lived, from North Africa to the Middle East to Europe. Here in America, Jewish people have contributed so much to your culture. This is not Judaism. To say that we are somehow superior, that we have more rights, that we have better claims to the land, it's not Judaism. Judaism is a religion based on social justice and anti-slavery and anti-racism. And I think that we will one day return to that. And when a state is built, whether it's Jewish or not, on those principles, then, I would be gladly, not a traitor in that state.
Tell us your own story, Leah. You, your family came to Israel, and your mother brought you to the West Bank, where you lived in a settlement. Even as peace accords were being signed, settlements were being expanded, and you were, I understand, only 6 years old. Where did you come from?
I was born in the Soviet Union, in what is today Ukraine. And when the Soviet Union fell apart just before we left and we moved to Israel, my mother was very much a Zionist in the Soviet Union, which was incredibly anti-Semitic. And she wanted to be part of this thing. She wanted to be part of this egalitarian society that we were being sold constantly by Israeli Jewish agents in the Soviet Union. And so when we moved, she wanted to contribute back to this Zionism, this idea that now Jews will no longer be discriminated because they're in a state, for the Jews, of course, completely blind and unaware that it's not just Jews that live there. So the way that she was encouraged to do that contribution is to move to the West Bank the same year that the Oslo Accords are being signed.
So what was your transformation? Obviously, you were too young to understand at the age of 6 what was happening, and you must have grown up accepting, like any children would, what the elders, the adults around you are telling you. How did you come to the place where you did? Your film On the Side of the Road is a very personal film, and you sort of feature your own position in it. How did that transformation take place?
I get this question a lot, especially people want to know, oh, you're a settler who became like this. How do we transform all the settlers? It was a very long and very violent process. You know, no one ever told me in school, we need to expel all the Palestinians. But by the time I graduated, I was completely sure that if they just weren't here, everything will be fine. And I think that a lot of people believe that. But I went to university in Canada, and until then, I had never actually sat down and had a conversation with a Palestinian person.
Wow. As
one-on-one, as equals. I've never actually met a Palestinian person, even though I lived in the middle of the West Bank, because the settlements are completely just Jewish. So you never meet Palestinians. And when I was in university, I remember I was standing in the student union building one day, and I was talking to a friend, and this guy comes up running, and he says, you know, how do I get to some place, you know? So he asks for directions, and I tell him, you go straight, da-da-da-da-da. And then he goes, oh, you have an accent, where are you from? And I say, oh, I'm Israeli. And he goes, really? Oh, I'm Palestinian. Don't you miss the motherland? Oh, it's probably so beautiful right now. Oh, the olive groves, if I could just walk through them one more day. Da-da-da-da-da. Anyway, thank you very much for the directions. Bye. And he ran off. And I stood there clenching my purse because my whole body was tense because I was sure that he was going to kill me.
Wow. On a university campus in Canada.
Yeah. And as I stood there, I realized he wasn't going to kill me. He knew I was Jewish, he knew I was Israeli, and he was not trying to kill me. And everything I had ever known about them is that they just want to kill us. And this such a simple incident, it started a very long process, and I have to say a huge thank you to a woman called Galia, who is an anti-Zionist Jewish woman who on my campus sort of stuck to me and followed me around for a while and asked me very difficult questions and forced me to answer for a lot of the things that I believed. And I very much wanted to be part of the army. I very much wanted to be part of this project and to contribute like everybody else contributes to this project. And when she started asking me these questions, a lot of things that I thought were true didn't make a lot of sense. And I have to say that this is part of the thing about collective denial, is that, you know, every time she would ask me questions, I would get flooded with this feeling like everyone who died is your fault. And everyone I lost and all of the suicide bombings and all of these experiences of of watching, burning buses and being surrounded by body parts and just madness, being teleported back to this place, watching the suicide bombings happen as I was growing up. And it forced me to deal with a lot of the trauma, but also a lot of the questions. And as I started to dig through a lot of these things that I thought were true, these things that I took for granted because no one ever asked me otherwise, I started to lay out a logical analysis. Right. And this is something we don't get to do in Israel very much, because no one ever asks, what do you think? What do you believe? Lay it out. What actually happened? If the Palestinians just want to kill us, then how come is it that they have been fighting non-violently all along as well? What is it that they want? And so once you lay that out and you sort of come out of your denial, you actually reach a place where things make sense. And you reach a sort of peace with yourself. And you don't need to silence the other. You can argue logically based on historical facts, because you're not afraid of that truth anymore.
Well, Leah Tarachansky, I want to thank you so much for laying out some truth for us, not only in this conversation, but in your film, which is called On the Side of the Road. It's the name of the documentary. You're on tour around the country. It's going to be screened in many locations this week in Los Angeles at a number of locations, as well as in New York, Portland, Oregon, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., many other cities. You can find screening information online at www.narrativeproductions.com. I'll spell that NARETIV productions.com. And you're going to be traveling with the film, so people who watch it can also meet you and ask questions of you. So I wish you the best of luck, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
My guest, Leah Tarachansky, is with the Real News Network, and she has made a documentary called On the Side of the Road. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our producer, and our program director, Camilo Ramirez, and Christian Beck are our production interns. Annie Mendoza is our media intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.